The struggle for independence achieved, the real work of nation building now began. What would Paine's role be in the creation of this new society? After prolonged negotiations, the Treaty of Paris was signed in November of 1783, officially ending the war. Paine took the opportunity to pen a supernumerary crisis, calling for a strengthening of the union between the states. On a personal level, he petitioned the Congress for a pension for his wartime services. A committee recommended Paine be offered the position of official historian. In June of 1783, the New York legislature awarded Paine a farm in New Rochelle, a property confiscated from a departed Tory. The farm was valued at around 1,000 guineas, gold coins worth £1 and 1 shilling. Paine also acquired a small residence in Bordentown, New Jersey, where he spent the winter of 1783 and 84. Madison and Washington did their best to have the Virginia legislature award land to Paine, but a decision was several times postponed. In 1785, Pennsylvania awarded him £500, with the prospect of a higher award later on. Also in 1785, he was awarded $3,000 by the U.S. Congress for his services during the war. Paine biographer David Freeman Hawke observes that, "From a nation unaccustomed to honoring literary gentlemen with cash rewards, Paine had received more than almost any writer would ever receive from a national or state government in American history." Paine now had to seriously give thought to his future direction. Would he continue to practice journalism, perhaps as editor of a new newspaper? Would he enter politics? He still had much to say about the development of new institutions in the United States. In 1785, in response to an escalating fight over the granting of a charter to the Bank of North America, he prepared a new pamphlet, Dissertation on Government, the Affairs of the Bank, and Paper Money. In this pamphlet, he attacked paper money issued by government and the requirement that citizens must accept this money in lieu of coinage. He did, however, express his support of paper money issued by private banks on the grounds that these notes could be accepted or rejected by individuals as they choose. The pamphlet was distributed to members of the Pennsylvania Assembly in February. Paine's attentions now turned to engineering and his own design for a single-span iron bridge. A model was completed in June, which he brought to the Philadelphia city leaders to propose being built across the Schuylkill River. Funding could not be raised for the project, so Paine decided he should return to Europe, where his prospects for approval of his bridge design by the French and English scientific academies seemed good, and where the resources to fund the project existed. Paine departed for France in April of 1787. In May, the delegates met in Philadelphia to begin the Constitutional Convention. Across the Atlantic, civil war erupted in the Netherlands, and Paine wrote a pamphlet warning the French that intervention would be fiscally irresponsible. The financial burden the French incurred assisting the American cause and fighting yet another war against Britain brought France close to financial collapse. Turgot, as finance minister, had warned of this inevitability as early as 1776, and had been dismissed by the king for his efforts. In August of 1787, the French Academy of Sciences endorsed Paine's bridge design. Paine then traveled to England to obtain endorsement from the Royal Society. A year later, He secured that endorsement and soon entered into partnership with the Yorkshire Ironworks to begin construction. The bridge sections arrived in London in May of 1791 and were then hauled to a nearby location for assembly. To avoid rusting, the bridge was to be coated with melted glass. Unfortunately, problems occurred during construction and the bridge was dismantled. A decade later, and what must have seemed to Paine a lifetime, an iron bridge incorporating his experimental arch design was constructed at Sunderland over the River Wear. He was hopeful that his bridge would then be constructed somewhere in the United States after his return. When the Congress failed to provide subsidy funds, Paine finally abandoned his dream and had his plans published in hope they would be of some use later. By 1787, Thomas Jefferson had arrived in France to represent the new United States. Paine and Lafayette frequently joined Jefferson in long discussions on every imaginable subject, including whether individuals possess natural rights. Paine argued that natural rights are those the individual can fully exercise without the aid of government, that men come together to form a civil society not to impose restraints on those rights, but to protect them. Separate from these natural rights are civil rights that emerge out of any social compact, those of personal protection, of acquiring and possessing property. In other writings, Paine came to address the distinction between property in land and property in goods we produce. In 1788, Paine also opened a correspondence with Edmund Burke, who had defended in Parliament the rights of the colonials as British subjects. He soon called on Burke, and they discussed relations between Britain and France. In 1789, unrest in France erupted into violence. The Bastille was taken in Paris, a people's army formed with Lafayette at its head. Severe winter weather and crop failures brought on food shortages, and the people of Paris marched on Versailles, where the royal stores were emptied. King Louis XVI and the Queen were then escorted to Paris and kept under protective custody. One of the first actions of the new National Assembly approved the confiscation of the lands of the Catholic Church. Paine wrote to Burke optimistically about the French Revolution. However, Burke saw nothing but the destruction of time-tested institutions and relationships. He decided to go on the offensive, producing Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in November of 1790. Although written to be a Whig manifesto, Tories and defenders of monarchy embraced the work. Burke knew that in Britain many Whigs had not yet reached the same conclusions, and he feared that the French disease might jump across the Channel. Paine's response to Burke was completed in February 1791, and a few hundred copies were printed and sold. British authorities threatened the publisher, and all unsold copies were recalled. Paine found another publisher and wrote a new preface to the second edition. In May, Paine journeyed to France to visit Lafayette. While there, he began work on another book covering the nature of monarchy. This became the second part of a new edition of Rights of Man, published in February of 1792. In Britain, mere possession of the book was sufficient to bring charges of sedition and treason. Paine asks why people form societies, then answers the question himself. Man did not enter into society to become worse than he was before, nor to have fewer rights than he had before, but to have those rights better secured. His natural rights are the foundation of his civil rights. In 1791, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette attempted to escape from Paris, but were captured and put under house arrest. In April of 1792, British authorities ordered Paine's arrest on charges of treason. His publisher was indicted for sedition. Paine quietly left London and made his way to the coast and is shipped to France. Even before his arrival on the continent, Paine was made an honorary French citizen and chosen a delegate to the National Convention. In September of 1792, he arrived in Calais, then made his way to Paris and the National Convention, where he served with Marie de Charette, the Marquis de Condorcet, on the committee charged with drafting the new French Constitution. When Louis XVI was put on trial for conspiracy against the revolution, Paine urged leniency, that a vote to execute Louis XVI would be viewed in the future as performed from a spirit of revenge rather than from a spirit of justice. Soon thereafter, the French National Convention created a Committee of Public Safety, setting the stage for the Reign of Terror. Paine was attacked as a foreigner and an enemy of the Revolution, then removed as a delegate to the National Convention. In October of 1793, Paine was denounced and declared an enemy of France. At the end of December, he was arrested and imprisoned at Luxembourg Palace. By a great accident of good fortune, Paine escaped execution. The story told is that the door to his room was opened outward when marked for him to be taken away and executed. That evening, when the door was closed, the mark no longer appeared on the outside, and his room is passed by. For unknown reasons, the executioner did not return. Paine languished in the prison, awaiting in vain for help from the American ambassador, Gouverneur Morris, who had earlier conveyed his concerns to George Washington regarding what he viewed as Paine's destructive presence in France. The French National Assembly finally turned on Robespierre in mid-1794 before he could attack them. He was denounced and on the 28th of July was guillotined without trial. His brother and 12 other followers are also executed. Paine's fortunes soon improved after James Monroe replaced Gouverneur Morris as the United States Minister to France. Paine wrote to Monroe requesting assistance in gaining his release. In September, Monroe responded to Paine that he would do all he could to get him out of prison, which finally occurred on the 4th of November. Monroe invited Paine to recuperate at his home, and Paine ended up staying with Monroe for over a year. Remarkably, Paine was reinstated to the French National Convention. He finally attended in July of 1795, speaking on the need to adhere to principles and not act out of expediency. Paine's next major writing resurrected principles he shared with the great French school of political economists, the Physiocrats. Agrarian Justice appeared in 1796, written in response to a sermon by the Bishop of Llandaff, attempting to give divine sanction to the existing maldistribution of wealth. Paine observes that poverty is absent among the indigenous tribes of North America and is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. Paine also recognized clearly the principle that the earth is the birthright of all persons equally, and he was sufficiently perceptive to recognize the practical problems of preserving this birthright. He writes, "As it is impossible to separate the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that inseparable connection. But it is nevertheless true that it is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property." As to means of achieving equal access to the earth, Paine accepted the solution advanced by the physiocrats. He declared, "Every proprietor of cultivated land owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds." In 1796, Paine wrote to James Madison, putting the blame on George Washington for his long imprisonment in France. Still quite ill after his 10-month stay in prison, Paine wrote, "I owe this illness, from which I have not much prospect of recovering, partly to Robespierre and partly to Mr. Washington. He ought to have said to somebody, 'Inquire into the case of Mr. Paine and see if there is anything we can do for him.' I ought not to have suspected Mr. Washington of treachery, but he has acted towards me the part of a cold-blooded traitor." In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte called on Paine, who provided Bonaparte with a plan on how to successfully invade England. Paine had become so embittered by how the American leaders had abandoned him that he ostensibly wrote an essay published in a French newspaper offering a plan for the liberation of the people of the United States from its new tyranny. Biographer David Freeman Hawke concludes correctly, I think, "Paine's rage slips out of control when he makes a witless comparison of the Reign of Terror in France to the Reign of Terror that raged in America during the latter end of the Washington administration and the whole of that of Adams." From this point on, for the rest of his days, Paine devoted his writing energy to the subject of religion. His final major work, The Age of Reason, was published in 3 parts in 1794, 1795, and 1807. On the one hand, the book stimulated a deistic revival in America. However, leaders of every organized religion recognized the work as an attack on them as corrupt and motivated by a desire for political power. Paine called upon people to use their powers of reason rather than revelation. He challenged the existence of miracles and the idea that the Bible was written by divinely inspired spokespersons for a conscious creator. The first part of the Age of Reason was an unrelenting attack on the Old Testament. Paine declared, "Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and tortuous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God." Paine's spirituality was based on something altogether different. It is only in the creation that all our ideas and conceptions of a Word of God can unite. The creation speaks a universal language, independently of human speech or human language. It is an ever-existing original, which every man can read. It does not depend upon the will of man whether it shall be published or not. It publishes itself from one end of the earth to the other. It preaches to all nations and to all worlds, and this Word of God reveals to man all that is necessary for man to know of God. In 1802, a tentative peace was negotiated between Britain and France, providing an opportunity for Paine to return to the United States. Jefferson made the arrangements on his behalf. Paine arrived in Baltimore at the end of October to a rather hostile reception, but was received at the Capitol by President Jefferson. Almost immediately, Paine began writing again regarding American affairs, charging that the Federalists were subverting the principles of the Revolution. He was particularly critical of both George Washington and John Adams. Early in 1803, Republicans in New York City held a banquet in his honor. Late in the fall, he moved to his farm in New Rochelle, but ended up staying in the village. After just a few months, he was drawn back to New York City. Paine's final years are taken over in the defense of his deist spiritual beliefs. From 1804 on, he wrote many letters and essays published in deist journals. Faced with deteriorating finances, Paine sold part of his New Rochelle property for $4,000 in 1804. His writing continued almost without pause, including a condemnation of missionaries who proselytized Indians. Commenting on Connecticut's blue laws, he wrote that they make a labor of rest, for they oblige a person to sit still from sunrise to sunset on a Sabbath day, which is hard work. He still owned about 240 of the original 300 acres of land in New Rochelle, and he was able to pay off most of his debts. Of all of those he had known well in earlier years, only with Thomas Jefferson did he carry on a correspondence. In one letter, he urged Jefferson to assume America's role as parent of the Western world, a measure that accords with the humanity of her principles, with her policy, and her commercial interest. In January of 1805, William Carver, one of Paine's few remaining admirers, came to New Rochelle and convinced Paine to come with him to New York City. From New York City, Paine urged Jefferson to settle Louisiana, quote, with free Negroes, unquote, who would work for a few years on the plantations, then be granted a tract of land of their own. He remained in New York City only until April, when he returned to the New Rochelle farm. Still, he continued to put his thoughts down on paper, and in June produced a pamphlet titled Constitutions, Governments, and Charters. He also reflected on the meaning of the American Revolution, writing, "The independence of America would have added but little to her own happiness, and been of no benefit to the world, if her government had been formed on the corrupt models of the old world. It was the opportunity of beginning the world anew, as it were, and of bringing forward a new system of government in which the rights of all men should be preserved, that gave value to independence." In the spring of 1806, William Carver came to New Rochelle to visit Paine. Paine biographer David Freeman Hawke writes that Carver found Paine disheveled and drunk at a tavern in New Rochelle. He had not shaved for a fortnight. Carver cleaned him up and cared for him until he was well enough to return with him to New York City. He stayed with the Carvers for 5 months, where he apparently succumbed to despondency and drank heavily, although mostly at night. He continued to walk about the city and write articles for the American Citizen, a newspaper published by James Cheatham. A final indignation came in November of 1806, when Paine returned to New Rochelle to cast his vote for members of Congress and the State Assembly. His ballot was rejected by the supervisor of the election on the grounds that Paine was not a U.S. citizen. Paine threatened to file a lawsuit, but his ballots were not counted. There were few still alive who could or would attest to Paine's citizenship. Returning to New York City, Paine at first stayed with the Carvers, then moved in with the portrait painter John Wesley Jarvis, who later wrote that he found Paine one of the most pleasant companions I have met with for an old man. Jarvis produced this portrait of Paine during the 5 months they lived together. As for Paine's use of alcohol, Jarvis commented, "Paine was not a drunkard. He did not and could not drink much. Loneliness drove him to the bottle, but in company he almost always kept within his capacity." In 1807, Jarvis moved into new quarters. Paine was forced to find rooms near the outskirts of New York City. Remarkably, during this time he kept up a lively correspondence, although he received very few visitors. Then in January, not wanting to spend what remained of his estate, he moved to even cheaper quarters in a tavern. He still owned his house and lot in Bordentown and the New Rochelle farm, but he was extremely short of cash. Finally, he agreed to sell the farm for $10,000, but this sale fell through. Petitioning the Congress for a pension, he wrote, "All the civilized world knows I have been of great service to the United States, and have generously given away talent that would have made me a fortune." Jefferson informed him that there was no chance of any further reward from the government. In the spring of 1808, he was forced to sell his property in Bordentown, New Jersey. He received $800 for the house and 7 acres of land. Now quite feeble, Paine moved into rooms in the village of Greenwich. He lingered on until the 8th of June, 1809, and his body was then buried on his land in New Rochelle. In 1819, an English Paineite named William Cobbett removed Paine's remains and took them to England, where they eventually disappeared. School children began to sing this song. Poor Tom Paine, there he lies. Nobody laughs and nobody cries. Where he has gone and how he fares, nobody knows and nobody cares.